Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me this evening for the 6th episode in the Conversation with Alan series. I started this series to have open and honest discussions about the rise of hate, the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, with high hopes that it leads to conversation that make us all think about our own place in history and what we can do together to change our country's course. Tonight, you will meet a group of 2G's, children of Holocaust survivors like myself, who are working to honor the memory and legacy of the survivors and victims, to promote awareness of the Holocaust, and to provide education of this and other genocides. Joining me for this conversation are Dr. Ettie Zilber, who is an author, educator, and speaker who serves on the board of the Phoenix Holocaust Association and supports committee work of the Anti-Defamation League and the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. Ken Engel, who is chair of the Children of Holocaust Survivors Association in Minnesota, a Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area group of children, second generation, grandchildren, third generation, and other descendants and friends of Holocaust survivors. And also Janice Freebam, who is vice president of the Phoenix Holocaust Association and a freelance educator, presenter, and trainer on topics related to the Holocaust, Holocaust survivors, and survivors' descendants. Janice and Ken are both members of the governing coordinating council of generations of the Shoah International, the world's largest Holocaust family organization. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Locher Room Ken Engel, Janice Freebam, and Dr. Ettie Zilber. Janice, Ettie, and Ken, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Well, Ettie, thank you for reaching out to me. I said it to you backstage, but I really did create this series in response to what happened in Charlottesville. For me at the time, I wanted to find a way to connect with other children of Holocaust survivors. So you just did that for me. So I appreciate that very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to share these stories together. Can you share a very brief sketch of your parents' story of survival during the Holocaust? Ettie, if you want to take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Both of my parents were from the same city in Kovno, as the Jews called it, Kaunas in Lithuania. They actually met in the ghetto when all of the Jews of the city were forced into the ghetto. Both had witnessed massacres and pretty awful things even before going into the ghetto. And in the ghetto, it was a fight for survival, work. They met, they actually married in the ghetto. And then my father had an opportunity to escape, and he did, with my mother's blessing. And but the women...
Yeah, that's an amazing part of your book. The fact that they marry first and then he is able to escape.
Well, in my family, the joke was, he had enough of marriage, so he decided to split, But gratefully, my parents had a great sense of humor. The women were taken to Stutthof concentration camp right on the Baltic Sea near Gdansk, and the men were all transported to Kaufering, which was a subcamp of Dachau in southern Germany. They all went through death marches, barely survived. Some did not survive. And my mother and grandmother were liberated by the Russians. My grandfather was liberated by the Americans. And my father, after his escape, he was liberated by the Russians in Kovno. So that's the quick version. Mm-hmm. And the full version, and I appreciate your mentioning it. The full version
definitely, yeah,
is written up in my book.
Great, Janice, do you want to?
Yeah. So in
I know it's not easy to do, our family stories but it gives people an idea, and I think that's important.
Sure. The quick sketch. Well, at least in my case, there's only one parent who was a Holocaust survivor. So my father's from Warsaw, Poland. And when war broke out in 1939 and Germany invaded Poland, he was 12 years old, one of 4 kids. And the Warsaw Ghetto was formed or officially sealed in November of 1940. But essentially his schooling ended the minute the Germans came into Warsaw. So no more schooling after 12 years old, never became a bar mitzvah. When the ghetto was officially sealed, my grandfather lost his job as a cabaret manager. He had to auction furniture in a big auction hall, and circumstances were incredibly difficult. Sure, people know the whole story about the ghettos, and things were miserable. My father seemed to take on the role in his family, even as a young adolescent, of being the family smuggler. And so he found a way to escape the Warsaw Ghetto, and he would take whatever money or valuables that his family had and barter with non-Jews in the Christian side of Warsaw. So that was kind of his role for about the 2 years he was in Warsaw with his family. As things became more and more dire, when they moved more and more Jews into the ghetto, 2 other families got moved into his 2-room apartment. So he was already living with 7 people, his 3 siblings, 2 parents, and a grandmother, and then 2 more families got moved into their 2-room apartment. Things were bad. My father escaped the ghetto one day to find food and could not get back into the ghetto afterwards. The guards had changed their positions, and my father was not able to safely come back in. From that point in the war, this is now probably early 42, he found himself on the run at 14 years old, sleeping in hayfields and in barns and knocking on people's doors, jumping trains, eventually contracted typhus. Some peasants found him, Polish peasants found him unconscious on the road, took him to what was the nearest city, which was Rodom, Poland, and dumped him off in the Jewish ghetto. So from that point on, and my father obviously recovered from that typhus in a hospital there, but from that point on in the war, he was in the web of the Nazi system. He was in a concentration camp for 2 years in Rodom, working in a slave labor ammunition factory. I'll spare you the details so I can do the quick sketch. And then when Rodom was evacuated in August of 44, the men were sent out on a death march to a town called Tomaszów, where they were put on cattle cars. Those cattle cars eventually took them to Auschwitz. And at Auschwitz, my father was put through 3 selections. Some of the men he was with were taken away, and some of the men, including him, were put back on the trains and shipped west into Germany. They didn't know where they were going, but they saw high mountains and they figured they were heading into Austria or Germany. This was now September of 44, and he went to a camp called Vaihingen in Germany near Stuttgart. It was miserable. He was there for 3 weeks digging ditches, then transported to a brand new camp called Hessenthal. This is October of 44. And this camp was probably the worst in my father's descriptions. People died in droves of dysentery and typhus. They had a miserable winter. My father had no shoes. He wrapped his feet in burlap, on and on. This camp, most of the prisoners were just clearing rubble from an airstrip that never saw any use. They would later learn after the war that there was an underground bunker at that camp where they were facilitating the assembly of the Messerschmitt airplanes. So and one day they were told to evacuate the camp, and they were put on trains, Allied bombing. The train was damaged. The prisoners were offloaded. Most of them were marched to Dachau Allach. This is the bitter end of the war in April. And my father was injured in that Allied bombing, and he and the other injured prisoners had to wait by the side of the train so that it was repaired and the tracks were repaired. It took about a week for him to wind up at the main camp of Dachau, Literally just 2 to 3 weeks before liberation is when he arrived. He couldn't walk. He finally was able to hop on one leg. They put him in barracks 28, and 2 weeks later handed civilian clothes, Red Cross package, and put on a train, a passenger train. They knew the end of the war was imminent, but they also thought they would probably be killed off before they were liberated. They were on the train for a day. They were taken out of the train, told to go down into a ravine where snow was up to their bellies. This was May 1st, and they figured they were going to be killed by machine guns that night down in the ravine. But when the sun came up the next morning, they heard big guns. And they knew that the Americans were close. So someone went out to scout this all out and found that the guards had disappeared overnight, and there were the American tanks. That was liberation, May 2nd.
He was really through it from 39 till the end. Wow.
Yep.
And Ken?
Just a question, Janice. Did your dad know whether or not the reason he was being sent behind Germany's borders was part of an effort to keep the witnesses, the survivors, from becoming available to Allied forces?
No, he was not aware of that.
Okay.
Not at all.
I was curious.
I think their impression was that they were needed for because the German men were fighting on the front, and laborers were needed in Germany at that point in the war. They were desperate for laborers.
Okay. Of course, there were lots of stories that they were told. So,
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Both my parents survived the Shoah. They both were from a small town in eastern Czechoslovakia called Munkac or Munkachevo or Munkachny. It goes by a variety of names depending on who was in control. Our dad was the oldest of 6 children in his family. My mother was the youngest of 8. It was a combined family for her. Our dad worked as a forced laborer, a slave laborer for 4.5 years. From May 1940 until January 1945, when he was then sent to a death camp in northeastern Austria called Mauthausen. His job there was to bury the dead. Mauthausen was the site where more than 90 people were murdered by the Germans. He estimated during his 3 months he was there that he buried 2,900 people. He was finally liberated by American forces, by the 11th Armored Division of the U.S. Third Army on May 7th, 1945, from a subcamp of Mauthausen called Gunskirchen, and he made his way back home as instructed by his dad the last time that he saw, who was my grandfather, who I never knew, to wait because everyone was supposed to reassemble. He was only one of 4 survivors out of 77 people in his family to make it out at the end of the war. Nobody showed up at the family home. And then picking up my mother's story, she was spent, because Eastern Czechoslovakia wasn't treated as harshly early on as Western Czechoslovakia by the Germans. The so-called Jewish question didn't become paramount until March of 1944. She and her family in March of 44, after being confined in an abandoned brickyard, that was the ghetto, in Munkac for approximately 15,000 Jews in a town that had approximately 30,000 total population. She and her entire family, all 44 members, were put on one of 3 trains to go northwest to a town called Auswiesen in southwestern Germany, Poland, excuse me. The German name for that town is Auschwitz. And she and one of her sisters made it past the selection and went to the right. She was marched out of Auschwitz in late December 44 as the Russians were approaching. The Germans, and this is part of the reason I asked my question of you, Janice. She was marched out as one of 3 death marches because the Germans were insistent on ensuring that not only did they cover the physical evidence of their crimes, but also to keep all witnesses away from the Allies, because no witnesses, there's nobody to testify against the perpetrators. So she ended up first in another death camp. This was behind German lines, called Buchenwald, and from Buchenwald, named for the birch forest that it was nestled in. And from there, she was sent to another death camp called Bergen-Belsen, which is where Anne Frank was sent, and died in March of 45. And she was liberated by British forces on April 15th, 1945. She was then sent to a British military hospital in Budapest. Our dad, making his way back to Munkac, waits for his family to show up. Nobody shows up. He finally hears word that a childhood friend of his, Tilly Collis, that was my mother's name, was in one of 20 British military hospitals in Budapest, Hungary, makes his way to Budapest. He's fluent in 9 languages at that point, but he can't read, write, or understand English. But being somewhat enterprising, got a hold of a listing of the British military hospitals in that city, and he made his rounds from hospital to hospital looking for Tilly Collis. He finally found her in the 16th hospital he visited. She was in a public ward in the hospital. Tilly had just turned 22. She should have been in the full bloom of young womanhood. She weighed 55 pounds.
Oof.
She was racked with dysentery, with typhus. The bacilli of the animal kingdom had quite the time with her, but the British nursed her back to health. Our dad stayed by her side for 6 months until she recovered. They then were married in a former concentration camp converted to a displaced persons camp in Bamberg, Germany. And while they were still there, they had 2 children, and they finally emigrated to the States in March of 1949. And there's a story about that too, but maybe later. But my mother was the only survivor of 44 people in her family. Our dad was only one of 4 in his family of 77.
Wow. You all have such details, which I'm so impressed with. How early in your childhood do you remember these? Were they willing to share these with you from early childhood? How did you go about, fleshing these stories out for yourselves to understand what because it is important to know as much as we can. I wish I knew more at this point. I was lucky to speak, to get them to do the Shoah videos. So that's on record. So, but you really have some incredible details, all 3 of you.
Yeah. Would you like to?
Sure. Yeah, Eddie, if you'd like to go first.
I thought I didn't know if it was my turn.
Yeah.
Well, I was born in a DP camp. So for me, I was with my parents during those years after liberation, although I was a baby, so I don't really have direct memories, but I'm sure I absorbed a lot of the trauma in my mother's milk, shall we say. And we immigrated to the United States together. So, and we were one of the very lucky survivors, because very, very few survivors even had a photo of any of their relatives who were killed. And in our homes, we always had these photos hanging on the wall. So it doesn't take long for you to figure out when your mom says, this was your grandmother and this was your grandfather. And you say, well, where are they? Well, they're dead. They died in the war. They died in the war. This one died in the war and that one died in the war. And so clearly the war was my entree and these pictures. And of course, I'm named after, in good Jewish tradition, I'm named after my grandmother, Ettie, and who was murdered in Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And and I knew that from a very young age.
Right.
Plus,
and you also told me 96%, right? Is 96%?
Almost 96% of Lithuanian Jews were gone.
Perished. Yeah.
Yes, gone. And so it was that. Plus, I didn't speak English until I went to school. And so when my parents got together with their friends and a few bottles of vodka, I used to hear all their stories, because these were our family in New York, where we settled. And so I would eavesdrop on all the stories, and so I would get in my head some of the, horrific facts. And so that was my earliest learning about it. And did they sit me down and say, okay, sweetie, I'm telling you about the birds and the bees? Never. Right. It's usually the other way around, or it would come out in context, or it would come out in an outburst of, the typical PTSD that some of our parents had. So
for sure.
Yes. And so and then as I got older, I did start asking questions, and it's again very gently and gingerly, as we say, because as soon as you ask a question, their eyes glaze up and you're sorry you asked the question. So we typically, second generation, were very protective of our parents, didn't want to cause them any additional pain. And so we kept our problems to a minimum and quietly, and tried to be good little boys and girls. But I did learn, and then later on in life, there were many other ways, because we immigrated to Israel at a certain point. And once you go to Israel, Holocaust is everywhere. And so, and I also learned more about Jewish history in general, and also worked at the Diaspora Museum. And I also helped interview some of the survivors in the Spielberg program. So I was learning throughout my life, mostly I would say the last 10 years.
And Janice, for you?
Well, how many different ways can you say the word no? As far as what I heard growing up in my home, nothing, nada, nicht, gar nicht. There was zero talk about the Holocaust in my home growing up. Now, what is different about my background than Ken and Ettie is that I only had one survivor parent. Right. So while I know many marriages, partnerships where there's one survivor and one non-survivor, and they are very healthy and loving partnerships, that wasn't the case in my home. And in my home, my American-born mother was not interested in my father's background, did not encourage him to talk about it. And in fact, I think, she was pretty critical of his poor English. So in my home, the Holocaust was the proverbial elephant under the rug, because it was so enormously present, but just not out there. It was enormously present because my father had a concentration camp tattoo on his arm.
Uh-oh.
No, I think
she froze.
She did freeze. Ken, do you want to?
Sure, and then Janice can jump in as soon as the signal reconnects. Well, there are similarities to Eddie's story. When my parents emigrated to the States, and after 3 months in New York, they, thanks to the Joint Distribution Committee, she'll rejoin, I hope.
Yeah, I just took her off because I can see she's still frozen, so I'll.
Okay, so the Joint Distribution Committee, which was a nonprofit based in New York that, amongst other things, helped survivors who arrived in the States to make their way across the United States to different homes or different cities for different jobs, etc. They directed my parents to go to Minneapolis, And so they arrived in Minneapolis, and they found when they arrived in Minneapolis that the native-born Jewish population in Minneapolis largely turned its back on the survivors for a number of reasons. They didn't want to be reminded of what the survivors went through or what the survivors represented. They had the impression of sheep going to slaughter, all those silly myths. So what this group of survivors did, and this was more than 200 families, was form. There you are.
Hey.
You want to continue?
Sure. So I'll just.
So you had just gotten to the number on his arm, and that's when you froze.
Right. I mean, the evidence was everywhere that something very, very wrong had happened in my father's past. There were no grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, none of them. And as Ettie pointed out, there were no photographs. My father came out of the war with 0 photographs of his family, the skin on his bones, the clothes on his back. That's it. No possessions, no home, nothing. And my father, not only did he not talk about the Holocaust, but he never even uttered the words, "When I was a little boy," never. It was as if his life began when he came to the United States. So it was very odd, very odd. And so my learning more was a journey that didn't begin until my 20s. And that's a whole other story. So go ahead, Ken.
Well, but that's kind of what I was saying to you, though, earlier backstage. For me, like, it took, you know, like you said, it takes a while. Like, you put all of these pieces that you've heard or you've listened to or you've heard another family member, and then you go on your own journey to sort of, you know, piece it together. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it was really important for you to do that for yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ken, continue. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Well, no, nothing to apologize for. And just to explain just a bit, the way that survivors responded, it was really a wide response across the spectrum. Some survivors openly spoke with their children, with others, about what happened before the war, what happened during the war, and what happened after. Many other survivors, however, racked with what has been referred to as survivor guilt, didn't want to impose what they saw, these memories, on their children, didn't want their children to believe that they were different, they were outsiders, they didn't fit in. They certainly didn't want these horrendous stories to be implanted in children's minds, because children's imaginations are like freight trains that know no limits whatsoever. And so they didn't want to impose that. That was their view. And I'm summarizing and generalizing, but a lot of survivors were like that. So you had lots of responses from different survivors on how they handled or didn't handle the whole issue about telling the family history, telling their own stories, and what and when they did that. A lot of survivors would open up, become more pragmatic, maybe as they got older and realized it's time to tell these stories. The world certainly was more receptive by the time many of them decided that. So anyway, going back, so my folks arrived in Minneapolis. The local Jewish community largely turned its back on this 200 family plus group of survivors. So our dad and another survivor helped create something called the New Home Club. And the New Home Club was a creation of a community of these 200 plus survivor families, where they figured, well, they don't want us, the hell with them. We'll put together our own family, our own community. And so I grew up around hundreds of survivors. And what I would do from a very early age, and Ettie, not everybody was good and nice and didn't want to cause trouble.
So you're telling us that you were on the other side.
I'm not saying anything of the sort. But what I would do is listen to the survivors, especially talk amongst themselves, because when they spoke with one another and they thought nobody was in earshot, they would go over different experiences. They would talk about this person, and they named 2 people in the community who collaborated with the Germans. And I'm not using the word collaborate in the modern business sense about people working together positively toward a gainful end. No. They were talking about people who worked together, who informed, who took advantage of fellow prisoners, etc. But I would listen to these stories. Now, from my parents, our dad would talk a little bit, but he thought I was too young to hear a lot of this, so he didn't say that much. Meanwhile, from the age of 3 or so, 3.5, because all the stories I'm hearing, luckily I'm already able to read. I'm starting to do my own research on what limited information was available. And I'd start talking with some of the other survivors and just ask them, tell me about this, tell me about this. Because in this extended family of 200 plus families, there were virtually no grandparents present.
That's right.
And Ettie touched on that as well, about pointing to the photographs. Well, that's your grandfather, that's your grandmother, but they're dead, they're gone. But not exactly saying why, even though it probably didn't take too much time or effort to figure out, oh, okay. So growing up in that situation, and that was the information from our dad early on, very little. My mother, her experiences, and the word is too gentle a word, they were so horrific during the war, and her memories of what she had gone through were so vivid that if I made the mistake of asking her a question, didn't matter if it was, what was life like for you pre-war, what was it like in Auschwitz, what was the journey from Auschwitz to Buchenwald, did you go by train, did you go by truck, did you go by foot, if I would be foolish enough at a relatively early age to start asking questions of her, she might do one of two things. She would either start to answer, maybe get about half a sentence into the answer, and she'd start crying.
Yeah.
Or the other response was she'd start screaming at me. So I learned real fast, I'm not going to her for information. That's not wise. And it was, so I had all these survivors I was around. I was already doing my so-called research at this early age. And the picture that was coming together, it didn't explain a lot. It just raised more and more questions about, well, what really happened? How come I don't have any grandparents? Because many of the people who weren't survivors' children that I played with, ran around with, almost everybody had grandparents and cousins and nieces and nephews and uncles and aunts. And in fact, for years, I would hear the word cousin and I would have to go through a laborious calculation. Okay, a cousin. What's a cousin? And I'd have to go a step-by-step process in my mind to try to understand that, because I had no direct context for it. So, I mean, eventually more information came from our dad, started talking with more and more survivors. I've been lucky enough to interview probably more than 400 survivors and just hearing their stories. But that's not really a substitute for your own family history.
No.
And again, that imagination, it loves to go into overdrive and take over. And so I had to do what I could to try to damp that. And that was done by information to the extent that I could get good information. But you've got this pitzel, the Yiddish word for a little one, who just this ravenous appetite for information, and without exception, the information that comes in is largely without context. It can't be verified in almost all cases unless I go to independent sources. And
you were certainly surrounded by survivors, which is an incredible, way to learn. I mean, not that you set out to do it at that point, but just being in that environment.
True. In fact, the word survivor didn't really come up until much later, because most survivors that I knew or spoke with early on would describe themselves in a variation on the phrase, I am what is left. And if you consider that phrase and consider what self-awareness and self-image is behind that phrase, you're talking to someone or hearing someone speak who considers themselves a remnant.
And there is a term in Hebrew for that, Sherita Plita.
Yes.
Right. And an organization in California with that name.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the name of the organization in California?
California that assists Holocaust survivors. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, with all of that, when did you make the conscious decision to, devote, your time, your energy to commemorating and educating others about the Holocaust? Janice, do you want to?
Yeah, for me, there actually was a distinct turning point. I was in my early 30s and just starting to connect a lot of the dots about how this growing up with a Holocaust survivor had deeply affected and shaped me. But a lot of my deep dive into this was very private. I was self-educating with books, films, movies, concerts, plays, attending academic conferences, and so on. But I wasn't speaking publicly. I wasn't sharing my father's story. Of course, at that time, I didn't have a good father's story yet. And I wasn't sharing my story yet. But here was my turning point. I attended a public hearing at a regional library in Olympia, Washington, where I was living. And the meeting was about people in the community wanted to remove a book from the library in the children's section. They wanted it pulled off the shelves.
Like now.
It was called Daddy's Roommate. And it was about two gay men raising a child. And so these people in the community felt that that book was a dangerous influence on young minds, and they wanted the book pulled from the library. So that at this public hearing that I attended, I went basically to just show my support for keeping the book in the library. And very extemporaneously, I stood up when there was an opportunity to go to the microphone for public comment, and without any premeditation, I got up and said publicly for the first time that I was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I was having an out-of-body experience because I didn't recognize who this person was who was saying that in public. And I drew the parallels between the Nazi effort to de-Jewify Germany with pulling those books off the shelves. And the parallels frightened me, and I felt that they were appropriate. And after I made those comments, I was flooded with people contacting me about what I had said and how it was so important that I spoke out. And that was really, for me, the beginning of realizing I have a particular vantage point that can make an important difference in the world. And I was going to stick with it.
Wow.
It's like a scene out of the film Field of Dreams.
That's a powerful moment. I mean, to not even realize you were getting up and going to say that.
Yeah, I didn't name as someone to provide testimony.
Wow.
Were you shocked when you did that?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I could see, I could, hear it in your voice now, even.
Yeah. It, there was, like I said, it felt like an out-of-body experience. Part of me was standing apart from myself going, who are you and why are you doing this? And yet there was this other part of me in control of doing exactly what I felt I needed to do.
Wow. Ken, for you?
Actually, for me, it was almost one of those, call it a serendipity moment. My daughter had just been born. I had just turned 30, and I'm holding her in my arms. She was about a week old. And it was funny because the thought that hit me was, this is the best revenge against Hitler. And I asked myself, well, where does that thought come from? Why that, in fact, why that view? And the next question I remember asking myself silently was, so what are you going to do about it? That's a a very self-satisfying, self-referential thought, but in a way, so what? How is this going to change anything aside from what she might do with her life? And it took a while to galvanize really the idea that, it's time to form a group of other 2G's, because I knew lots of 2G's from growing up, and some were still willing to talk with me at that point. We won't get into, Ettie, what you were talking about good and nice and etc. But we started comparing notes and realized, maybe what we need to do is start with selfishly ourselves. We each have a story to tell. Many of us never really shared those stories with one another or with anyone else. Let's start there. And so we formed this local group called CHAIM, Children of Holocaust Survivors Association in Minnesota. It's an ad hoc group, not legal organized as a 501c3, et cetera. It's just an ad hoc group. And we got a hold of a local therapist who specialized in treating survivors' issues, and sat down with her. There were 8 of us, and sat down with her and said, here's what we're looking to do. And she said, well, that's nice. Where do you come from? And so each would tell their story, and it took several meetings to do that. And eventually the thought came, education's a real big part of this. How are we going to stop or try to stop what could happen again easily? Because Skokie was already history by this time. That is, the American Nazi Party's threat to march in Skokie and Evanston. And so the idea was, well, the more information we can put out, and the wider that information can disseminate, the more impact we might have on getting people to think a little differently and consider things differently. And the moment they do that, maybe there's hope they'll start talking with other people and changing their own behavior. Maybe. Relatively naive view. But it was Hannah's presence that really triggered that. It was kind of that boom moment, just as it was for Janice, just in a little different setting, but the same, hey, this can't go on.
Well, it can. And also, having that daughter, we're all alive because of other people who helped save our families. So we're here because of what other people and our own, parents did to survive. So it's, I can see, sitting there holding your child, a lot resonates, I think, in those moments.
Maybe, but respectfully, we're here more because that there weren't enough people who did anything to help. The great majority either stood aside or happily collaborated with the perpetrators for a variety of reasons, mostly self-interest. I don't think it was because so many people helped, because if so many people would have helped, there would not be. We wouldn't have had the number of people who were murdered. We wouldn't have had the dispersal. We wouldn't have had the same ramifications that come to the present day, because
we might not be having this conversation at all.
Correct.
Except in German, right? It's
and a very different one.
Yeah. So
yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you for saying that and clarifying that.
It's just my view.
But I think it's clarity. That is a great point, and I appreciate you saying that. Ettie, for you, and please talk about the book. Because you recorded your mom, right?
Yes, we did. And but just getting back to the question that you had asked, when was the epiphany? I mean, as I mentioned, we had immigrated, the whole family immigrated to Israel in 72. I was married there, had my children there. And so clearly I was learning an awful lot about Israel, about Jewish history, and about the Holocaust. And I realized when I had my children that there was something, there was a fear in me, and it was a deeply seated, irrational fear about their well-being. And later on, I learned what that fear meant. But my epiphany was when my mother gave me a copy of the book Children of the Holocaust by Helen Epstein. That was my moment where I said, oh, there's someone else like me? What is this? And it dawned on me that, you know, this event was not just my personal event. This event, called the Holocaust, impacted millions, and not only them, their children, and we are telling very similar stories. I said, oh, how did you know my story? And that was the epiphany moment as far as the impact of the Holocaust on the next generation for me. And I continued studying about it. My father died very early of cancer, and we never had the foresight to sit him down and record him. Neither of my parents did any of the Spielberg recordings. And so we never got my father's full story, except anecdotally, which we did record on our own. But when my mom was getting older, we realized, you know, we better sit her down. And of course, she never did want to talk about it. But, you know, there's nothing better to tell a grandmother than saying, your grandchildren need to know this. That's the key word. So as soon as your grandchildren need to know it, she pulled herself together and we sat for, I don't know how many hours. My sister recorded her, and I have all of those recordings in my possession. If I, you know, really want to have a good cry, I put them on. I listen to them, but I started transcribing it. I had no intention of writing a book. I don't think my mother would have wanted me to write a book, but that's another story. And this book started taking on a life of its own, and I decided to go on a trip, an odyssey, a journey in their footsteps. So every single place she mentioned, every single archive I could get to, I went in Lithuania and Poland, and I kept a journal. And then coming back, I was asked by the Phoenix Holocaust Association to give a presentation about my family, and I did. And they asked me, and could you please talk about the impact of the Holocaust on your life? And so I started, you know, making notes and putting together my little presentation. And as they say in Hebrew, mahon lahon, you know, and as it turned out, this whole memoir got got published in a book, and it is my mother's testimony verbatim, as well as my analysis. It's almost like a double memoir, focusing on the impact of being a child of Holocaust survivors. So it was an evolutionary process. It was never a goal to say, okay, I'm going to sit down and write a book. That never happened. And since the book was published in January 2019. Since then, I've given 60 presentations about the story all over the world. I was invited to Germany, and I spoke at 6 schools. I just recently spoke to students in a school in Lithuania, in Peru, and as an international school head of school, I would tell my students the stories as well when it fit into the curriculum. So I've been doing this for a while.
Good for
So
you.
that's my catalyst and the outcome.
Well, it's a great outcome. What in your eyes is the most important message you'd want people watching to take away today?
You're asking me?
All three, but if you want to go first.
Eddie, you spoke up. It's yours.
Well, when I give my presentations, depending on the age of the audience and the makeup of the audience, I have different messages. The first message I tell students, but it's actually a message for parents and grandparents as well. I give the students homework. Go home and interview the oldest members of your family. And I've said this to kids from 125 countries. So it's not just about Jews. I tell all kids, you need to know your family history. You need to know about your grandparents and your great-grandparents in order to understand who you are. And that's the basis of understanding the other. You first have to understand yourself. So that's one message that I hammer home to both the adults as well as kids. The other message I deliver is my mother's famous quote, my mother's famous words, which I thought were hers. Turns out Nietzsche said it before her. It's what doesn't kill you makes you strong. And no matter how bad things are, you will be stronger. You will get out of it. You will come through. And that's just life. Life isn't going to be just, stepping on fields of cotton. And the other message that I have started giving is to be active in maintaining and protecting our democratic society and everything that entails.
100.
Because once you lose your democracy, all this other never again stuff is just a moot issue. You can't stand up and speak out if you've lost your democracy. You can't give your opinion, write your opinion, if you've lost your democracy. So we got to protect our democracy.
Yeah. Janice, for you?
So amen to much of what Ettie said. I suppose I impart similar messages when I give presentations, and Ettie's correct. It's very much audience dependent on what message you stress. For your listeners today, Ellen, I would say that given our group of children of Holocaust survivors and people coming away with a message from what we say today, I would have pretty much a simple message that the impacts of genocide are far-reaching. They go across many, many generations. And it's a legacy for sure that we inherit. It's a legacy of trauma. It's a legacy of genocide, but we also have a choice with what we do with that legacy. And whether we use that legacy and how we use that legacy to make the world a better place. And I think I can speak for Ettie and Ken, and I barely know you, Alan, but I'm going to take a stab and say I think we've all made that choice to do that, to use our legacy to make this world a better place.
Very much so. And Ken, for you?
Well, one of the things I've found is that we seem to learn, and others seem to learn more effectively sometimes from stories than anything else. Not always, but often, because there is an almost immediate connection that's created by telling stories. And so I'm going to end with the story, but I'm going to start with an admonition. And the admonition is something that I learned from our dad relatively early, which was listen very carefully to what people say, because what they say they're going to do, trust them, they mean to do it. There may be a smokescreen involved. It may not be the clearest message, but if they make a threat, understand they intend to follow through with it if they can. And so, in other words, don't minimize what somebody says, saying, they're just words. just echoing what Janice just said, they have far-reaching consequences. On the other side, there's also there's an aspect to the Shoah, to what people went through, that basically girds people with a different set of understandings and experiences, so they respond to the world in different ways. And one of the ways I'm going to illustrate is I referenced that my parents arrived in the United States in 1949. They arrived on March 17th, 1949 at Ellis Island. March 17th is St. Patrick's Day. They were processed through Ellis Island same day. They took the ferry across the Hudson. They landed at a point, the southernmost point of Manhattan, called Battery Park. And it was still March 17th. And when our dad climbed down from this ferry boat that brought him across the Hudson, he saw Battery Park filled with thousands of people
dressed in green
who were celebrating. And many of them were wearing a shamrock button. And our dad said he was petrified when he saw this, because he thought it's one of two things. It's either this is a paramilitary group that's either just finished celebrating a huge victory over some poor unfortunates, or they're gearing themselves up to wail over a group of poor unfortunates. The other, he said, was he had in mind, this is the secret police. And every once in a while, they show up in public and they use this shamrock button that many of them are wearing to identify themselves to the public, to say, don't think we've gone away. We're here. Watch your step. And of course, for the paramilitary group, our dad said they wear that shamrock button to identify themselves to one another as fellow militia members. And another survivor took our dad aside, because our dad expressed it, and he said, no, Mechel. His name was Mechel Engel, Michael in English. He said, no, Mechel, you've got it all wrong. Today is St. Patrick's Day. It's a day that's sacred to the Irish in Ireland, but in the United States, it's considered to be a national holiday, a day of celebration, and everybody basically parties and celebrates, and they wear the shamrock button to show their solidarity, because the shamrock is a sacred symbol to the Irish. So our dad wore a shamrock button on St. Patrick's Day for every St. Pat's Day until he died 11 years ago. And my sweetie, my wife, and I have that shamrock button. And the first 11 years, where every St. Patrick's Day he would wear that button, and a fellow survivor would take him aside and say, Mechel, what the hell is wrong with you? What are you doing? I mean, it's not exactly a Jewish holiday. What are you doing? And he said, it was the best day of my life because it was the day I found my freedom.
Wow.
In other words, we live with hope. We're not naive enough to basically throw aside what we hear people say they're going to do, but we always have looking for things to be a little better, and we understand we need to work hard to make that happen. Okay, I'm off my soapbox.
No, that's great. That's a great story. Do you guys have like 10 minutes? Because I have a couple more questions. Are you okay?
Sure. I just wanted to add a little coda to what Ken said. While his dad's first day in this country was the day of his, freedom, the beginning of his free life, my father's experience was 180 degrees opposite of that.
Yeah.
When my father stepped foot on the shore here at New York Harbor, September 16th, 1946, he told me that's when my real troubles began.
Sorry.
Quote, unquote. And in fact, those earliest years that my father was in this country, yes, this country, were incredibly difficult and lonely and tragic. And that's really the hub of the book I'm working on. I'm really going to focus on that lesser known chapter of some survivors' lives, where after the war, when they got to their their new countries, whether it be Palestine/Israel, Australia, South America, the United States, Canada, things weren't necessarily so easy. And for some survivors like my father, who fell through crack after crack in the social services net system, things were heartbreaking.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. By the way, what attracted your parents to one another? What you described before, Janice, it wasn't exactly a loving marriage.
Well, I would bet there was some kind of love there originally. What attracted them, very simply, my mother's parents were from the old country, from Russia, and her parents spoke fluent Yiddish. In fact, they spoke very little English. So when they met my father, whose own first language was Yiddish, they fell in love with my father. And they also felt a deep kinship with him, knowing what he had been through. Because my mother's parents came to this country 15 years before the Holocaust and knew, had they not left in time, they probably never would have survived. So they really adored my father. My father adored them because they felt familiar to him from the old country. Mm-hmm. My mother, on the other hand, was trying to do that distancing away from her immigrant parents and wanted to be an American more than anything. So why did she marry my father? An immigrant? Well, as she explained it, he was good looking and drove a car.
He drove a car, is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. There you have it.
Yeah. Now, the immigration experience for all the survivors was not easy, was absolutely not easy. And that's a piece that maybe we think we welcome immigrants. Maybe we could do a little better.
Well, I know Ettie and Janice, I know you both, have done a lot of research about the correlation between trauma victims and the transmission of that trauma to us, the next generation. Can you speak a little, both of you, to this? And Janice, I'm actually interested because you said you're sort of doing this, training social services and frontline healthcare workers now on these issues. So.
Right. Right. There, I would say for the last 20 years, but increasingly over those 20 years, there have been people very attuned to the issue of Holocaust survivors in their final chapters of life, in their elderly years, and particularly when dementia may become more prevalent, start to re-experience traumas. So I do training with agencies that have social service workers and frontline healthcare workers to sensitize them to the very particular issues that Holocaust survivors face in their elderly years. They do have some unique concerns, and if we can provide people with the knowledge and some skills about how to handle certain situations with aging Holocaust survivors, then everyone is the better for it. So that's one type of training that I've been doing for the last 10, 15 years. The other, I wouldn't call it training, I've been giving presentations on intergenerational transfer of trauma. I've taken kind of a big dive into the literature and the research on it, and hands down, I think there's agreement in the fields of psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, that there is intergenerational trauma. The phenomenon exists. Studies have been looking at that since the 60s. They've looked at the children of Holocaust survivors. And unfortunately, in the 60s and 70s, all of the initial reports were about how dysfunctional we were, the children of survivors, how being raised by damaged parents, the Holocaust survivors, would necessarily mean that we would become damaged and dysfunctional and have pathologies. So fortunately, into the 80s and 90s, the research took
Changed.
and they started to recognize that, well, in fact, there's a flip side to this, and the children of Holocaust survivors also tend to be extremely successful, very driven, very attracted to the helping professions, and so on. So, but getting back,
part of the, if I may jump in, part of that in the 60s was the only ones that they were getting to analyze or to see were the ones who were dysfunctional. They weren't going out to seek out the general population. So
Right.
of course, if they're seeking out psychological help, these are the ones who were dysfunctional, but all the other guys, they never got them. They never interviewed them or analyzed them or researched them until much more recently. That's
Right.
why it was so dysfunctional. I've done research on children who are internationally mobile, and it was the same thing. In the early years, the only ones that the psychologists would see were the ones who had psychological problems. But the vast, vast majority were fine.
Mhm.
And the ones they wrote about were the ones who had serious problems. And that's why people thought, oh, it's a terrible thing to take your children to live in other countries because you're going to, excuse me, do them harm.
Right.
And so it's a similar situation. And
that was seen by moving your child to another country by doing them harm.
The internationally mobile families who would move because of parents' careers, diplomats, multinationals, missionaries, these were the people who were often moving their kids around. And that's a whole other story.
Right.
I'm happy to come on your show another day and talk about that one. But there are similarities. It's interesting that I focused on those kids because of my background. And I did my doctoral research on those kids because of my background. So that is a direct correlation to my growing up as a child of survivors, that was a field of interest for me.
It's fascinating because I really, I read a book recently from Generation to Generation, Healing International Trauma Through Storytelling by Emily Wanderer Cohen, who's also a 2G and who was abused, sadly, by her mother, who was really transferring that trauma to her, and took her a long time to understand.
Yeah.
While it's important to tell stories, it is, you have to be careful using a particular anecdote from a particular story and extrapolating it and say, you see, all of these people are having difficulties because listen to this story. So you got to be careful with stories as well.
Janice?
But I will offer that I've lived all over the country, and in many of the places I've lived, I've either launched a group for descendants of survivors, or I've joined one that already existed. And for the last 30 years, I've done this. And I've been part of lots of discussion groups with children of survivors, and I've heard, hundreds and hundreds of stories, very personal stories. And I have to say that there's quite a gamut of experiences among the children of Holocaust survivors. Yes, I have met my fair share of pretty damaged, dysfunctional children of survivors. And I have met among the most put together, highly functional, intelligent, and successful people in my life who also happen to be children of Holocaust survivors, and everything in between. And yes, I've met children of Holocaust survivors who were sexually abused by their survivor parents. It happens. Children who were physically abused and beaten by their survivor parents. Yes, I don't say this to hang out any dirty laundry, but only to say that in this sense, we're normal.
Right.
No different than the general population.
Correct.
Good stuff happens in our families and bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
which underlines the old view, who wants to be normal?
Well, and it also shows how deep these scars are as well, you know, that you talk about. You have all inspired me, because I am going to look for a 2G group in my area. You have all inspired me.
There are a lot in New Jersey.
I'm sure. And I've wanted to do that, and I just have not, but the minute I'm done, I'm going online.
Ask Janice, she knows.
Yeah, if you know them, Janice, please do share them if you know any in New Jersey. I would love you, before we go, two things, to talk about the Phoenix Holocaust Association, and then Ken and Janice, the organization you're involved with as well. Please share. This is the Phoenix. So if you want to tell us what the Phoenix, Ettie sits on the board, right? And Janice, you're the vice president?
Yes. So Phoenix Holocaust Association has been, I'm vice president, right? So we've been around 37 years. We are more robust now than we ever have been. And that sounds a little counterintuitive, because people think that, well, with the fewer numbers of survivors, a lot of organizations seem to be shrinking. But in fact, what's happened is, as our numbers of survivors have lessened, the descendants and members of the community have really stepped up to bolster the organization and enliven it. So we are doing more now than we've ever done. We have robust educational programming. We do everything from book discussions to film screenings, bringing in speakers, performing artists. We have had events, a speaker that attracted over 1,000 people. We've had audiences of 800. We've had museum exhibits that brought in tens of thousands of school children and adults. We have a very active speakers bureau with Holocaust survivors and descendants. We speak to schools, colleges, faith congregations, civic groups, business groups, governmental entities like the military and prisons. We talk to prisoners. We have the annual Holocaust remembrance event called Yom HaShoah, and we are known as the largest commemoration in all of Greater Phoenix. We just had our Zoom version a few days ago. We provide support to Holocaust survivors. We provide them with rides. We help them file their taxes. We find them low-cost dental work. And we just recently assisted with scheduling them for appointments for COVID vaccines. We also have social events, which for aging Holocaust survivors has turned out to be, for some, a real lifeline. Every month we have these luncheons where they get together and they schmooze and they revisit their connections. So it's been a very important part of what we do. We have social events for descendants as well. We like to promote camaraderie and, foster connections. And finally, we also do Tikkun Olam. That's part of our mission, which means repair of the world. Recently, during the pandemic, a number of us stepped back and thought, wow, doctors and nurses are being recognized for being on the front lines of COVID. But there's another group that's on the front lines. Many groups are on the front line, but one group just remains unsung as far as heroes are concerned. And that's the caregivers at senior residences. What they had to deal with and still are having to deal with during this pandemic is just extraordinary. And we wanted to find a way to recognize them and appreciate them. So fast forward, we raised a lot of money very quickly. We ended up giving out grocery gift cards that were between $50 and $60 to every single caregiver, over 320 caregivers at 5 different facilities. So we're very proud of that. We also are now very involved in trying to pass legislation in the state of Arizona for making Holocaust and genocide education mandatory.
Wow,
so
that would be amazing.
We're taking on a bit of an advocacy role as well. We were very close to passing that legislation last year, but the pandemic kind of aborted our legislative session. So
we need that throughout every state.
Yes, ideally.
No, there are only 14 states that mandate it. That's different than recommend.
Right now, there's 14 that mandate it. That doesn't make it mandatory? Is that what you?
No, there are 14 states in the United States who have which have Holocaust education mandated. The others, there may be others that recommend Holocaust education in the curriculum in public schools.
Well,
so there's a
14 is certainly not enough.
Yeah, mandated and recommended. That isn't to say that there aren't many schools that are teaching about the Holocaust,
right?
But that's an internal decision,
right?
And the next battle on that one is it's great to have Shoah education mandated, but if teachers haven't been trained on how to teach, the mandate is a scrap of paper. So the next step, and this is already happening in a number of areas, is requiring a certain minimum training that teachers have to go through. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC has a program where they brought in, over the last 20 years, 100 teachers. It was once a year, and now it's 3 times a year, to go through a week-long training session on the history of the Shoah. So you can actually use this information and use the tools presented to teach it in your schools. Because again, having the requirement to teach doesn't mean anything if you don't have the tool.
It's the same, I think for the Black Lives Matter folk, teaching, Black Lives history in schools. I mean, it's the same thing. If you don't have educators who can educate their students about this and civil rights and all of that and genocide, it starts with education. I think all of it.
Absolutely. And we're working on, we put together a task force, we put together resources, training for the teachers. It was quite a mammoth project, and it's an excellent project in conjunction with the Department of Education in the state. So yes, you're right, Ken. Teachers have to be trained. And, it's a subject that some teachers are really afraid to broach. But those who are trained are quite passionate about it.
And Ken, do you want to talk about the coordinating council of generations of the Shoah International?
And I was just going to add to what both Janice and Ettie said, that without the training, as they say in Kentucky, that dog don't hunt. So Generations of the Shoah International, as Alan already mentioned, we are the world's largest Holocaust family organization. We have tens of thousands of members across every continent without, as far as I know, Antarctica. Janice, if you know different, please say so. We act as the bridge between the international and intergenerational Shoah survivor community and the major Holocaust organizations and institutions. We have a monthly e-newsletter that goes out where we share information and resources, which also includes announcements about events, news on upcoming events such as conferences, seminars, programs of interest, and we provide links to a wide range of articles of interest to our global-wide communities. We maintain a leadership listserv to reach intergenerational groups wherever the need arises. We provide programming for academic, survivor, and international events, conferences, and groups. We help with community building by helping new groups form and grow. We do know about groups in Jersey, and in fact, if you go to our website,
this is for you, Alan.
I know it is.
Handed on a platter. If you go to our website,
yeah, exactly.
www.genshoah.org, you'll find lots of information and resources there. We have a great webmaster, and the information on there is maintained very, very current. We play a leadership role. We have 14 members of the leadership group called the Coordinating Council, which is 13 2G's and 3G's and one child survivor. But each of us have a leadership role in our local survivor or descendant communities. We host Facebook groups for those who deal with Facebook. We have an online book and film discussion group. We're really a seasoned resource for our sisters and brothers and for organizations and institutions about the Shoah. We advocate on behalf of survivors and survivors' interest. And we also respect and value local groups, and we offer assistance only when requested, which is a little different from some Jewish organizations. And lastly, I think it's quite interesting, but the advocacy that we do on behalf of survivors, it's not just in the United States. We've done it worldwide. We're not a 501c3 organization, so we can't lobby. We're prohibited from doing that, but we maintain contacts. We try to work those contacts. We provide information. We write op-eds. We provide speakers to advocate on behalf of survivors' interests. And one of the most wonderful things of all is that we are self-supporting. We have never taken a nickel from anyone outside of our coordinating council. And we really pride ourselves in our independence because it allows us to really pursue what we believe is important for survivor and descendant interests.
That's great. That's great. Before we go, I want Janice wrote this amazing poem, Silent Conversation. I'd love to hear what prompted you to write it, and if you would read it, and then I will come back on and say goodbye to everybody. But Janice, if you take it away.
Sure. I'm honored that you asked, Alan, actually.
Well, I'm glad I found it because I thought it was great.
So this poem came to me after attending a meeting with my father in South Florida. He was going to his local Holocaust survivor monthly meeting. And the topic they discussed that day, I sort of felt like an interloper because I wasn't a survivor sitting in the back of the room, but the topic of their conversation was talking to their children about Holocaust experiences. And I was so struck by their angst and their fears and their yearnings. And I basically saw their side of the story. You know, I had been wrapped up in my own side of the story, but I really saw theirs. And I realized that we had been for decades involved in a silent conversation with one another, the survivors and the descendants. So
I kind of, you know, as you told your father's story earlier, I felt that a little, you know, I sort of connected sort of your story a little there, you know, from the poem. It made me think of that, you know, when you were telling that. So if you want to take it away, I'm going to put you full screen while you do so.
Sure. Silent conversation. Do not mistake our silence for indifference. Do not assume we don't care because we don't ask. Like you, we hold much more than meets the eye or ear. You were mute to free our spirits. You kept secrets to spare us grief. Yet we were tethered to your pain and mourned for your losses. How could you know your eyes spoke volumes and your silence painted pictures? How could you know that not answering?
Oh no.
Oh no. No.
Oh, here she's back.
Continue.
How could you know?
How could you know?
How could you know that not answering our first question would teach us to never ask another? No one told you what to do with the weight of ineffable trauma. No one told you what to say to the kinder. What if you started to speak and never could stop? What if you never spoke and lost all memory? There was no book to show you the way, no light to guide your parenting in your orphan darkness. We knew how thin the shells of your sorrow. We felt the tank traps before your no entry zones. Nothing separated us in our dance of mutual protection. In perfect step we moved, not too close, not too much, not so soon, please don't push. If you think we didn't care, we thought you didn't either. If you think we didn't need your burdens, we thought we wouldn't trouble you with ours. Quietly you despaired that we may never want to know. We lamented the history, our history, that you would never let us have. You thought, we thought, you assumed, and so did we. All to keep us safe, all to keep you unhurt. This is our story, you and us. This is the dance of those who suffered and their children. This is our story. We continue the dance, however flawed, however ungraceful, protecting one another, inventing the steps in our conversation of love. If you now have answers, please know we have questions. Together, we will write the guidebook never written for us.
Amazing. Really.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. Eddie's book is available. It's I have the link up on YouTube. So if you don't get it, check it out. Here it is right here. Thank you all so much for being here and for this conversation. You know, I really do think these conversations are, you know, as small or as large as they are really going to help change our world. Or I hope. That is my hope. Yeah, that is my hope. And you really, Eddie, I'm so glad you, like I said earlier, that you reached out and for introducing me to Janice and Ken. Stay well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Alan.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everybody. You know, again, thanks Ken Engel, Janice Freebam, Dr. Ettie Zilber. I hope you enjoyed our conversation tonight. Please feel free to share these episodes with friends and family. Like I said, I truly believe conversations like this can change the world around us. Have a great evening, everybody.